podcast. As always, I'm your host, Matt Hamilton. Delighted to have your company with me for a discussion today on the topic of self-optimisation. Now, that is a little bit of a broad term. You might wonder specifically what I mean by that. What I want to do is give us techniques and strategies to avoid burnout. A very significant issue at work, that's for sure, and something that is certainly best avoided if we can. And we'll get into the specific techniques to avoid burnout towards the end of the episode. But what I thought would be useful is if we begin by setting the scene, as we always do, for the episode by understanding a little bit more about burnout, what it is, what to look out for, what causes it, and then we'll get into some solutionizing perhaps towards the end of the podcast. But without further ado, let's go and have a bit of a deep dive into burnout. All right, so firstly, burnout at work is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, and it's often caused by prolonged and excessive stress, especially in the workplace environment itself. It's not just feeling tired, it's chronic stress that hasn't been successfully managed. Burnout often leads to reduced productivity, feelings of cynicism, or even detachment from the job and a sense of inefficiency. So what causes it? We'll just focus on the primary factors. They are things like heavy workload, lack of control or autonomy at work, unclear job expectations, toxic workplace culture, a particularly nasty one, work-life imbalance, which is very common, and a lack of recognition or reward. Let's turn our attention to some global stats on burnout because they are interesting, and here are some key findings from recent studies and surveys. We'll begin with the World Health Organization classification. So in 2019, the World Health Organization officially recognized burnout as an occupational phenomenon in the International Classification of Diseases category. From a worldwide trends perspective, a 2023 Gallup report found that 44% of employees globally say they feel, and I quote, a lot of stress, end quote, during the workday, which is a common precursor to burnout. Then in 2022, Microsoft released a set of results from their Work Trend Index survey, and that revealed that 48% of employees and 53% of managers, that's us, report being burned out at work. So the majority of managers report being burned out at work according to those results, and a significant number of employees at 48%, so very concerning. Let's break it down by industry. Three primary ones popped up here. They were healthcare, education, and tech. Burnout is particularly high in all three of those. Let's begin with healthcare, where over 60% of healthcare workers report symptoms of burnout. In education, teachers and academic staff frequently report high emotional exhaustion, probably quite understandable for those of you who know about the education sector or have worked in it. And then finally, in tech, long hours and high pressure contribute to burnout rates of above 40% in some tech roles. So very significant numbers there. Let's have a look at the stats by region. So in the United States, we'll start with our friends in the US. Around 76% of workers have experienced burnout, according to a 2023 report by Deloitte. 76% of workers. Now, that is far and above any other region, you'll note as we go through these results. I'm interested to know what causes that. So 76% of workers have experienced burnout in the US. In Europe, countries like France and Germany report lower, but still really significant burnout rates, and they're sitting at around 30 to 40% of employees who feel chronically stressed. Then in the Asia Pacific region, specifically Japan and South Korea, burnout is actually tied closely with overwork, translated to karoshi in Japan, which means death by overwork. And it is interesting to note that cultural stigma makes burnout underreported. So an extra challenge for those working in the Asia Pacific region with burnout. So who's most at risk? So women, essentially, and that's because working mothers often report higher burnout levels than men, and that's due to combined work and family responsibilities. Then we have younger workers, specifically Gen Z and millennials. They often report higher burnout levels, possibly due to job instability and perhaps some digital overconnection. And then finally, our remote workers who struggle with blurred work-life boundaries and isolation, which contributes to burnout. So an interesting little excerpt on burnout, what it is, what causes it, and some symptoms to look out for. So my initial thoughts on this, just to bring it back to a personal perspective, is that sometimes when we want to avoid burnout and get the best of it out of ourselves, sometimes less is more. You know, effort is excellent. It's not just excellent, it's required for success. And more often than not, it's required over a really prolonged period of time. Rarely does success just fall into your lap when you put in effort for a couple of weeks. You know, it needs really significant investment from a time perspective. But while that's important, it's necessary that we ensure our effort is not wasted simply because we're spinning our wheels. Now, what does spinning our wheels look like? So after a prolonged period of effort, it could take the form of excessive stress and some of those symptoms that we just went through in our excerpt there. It could be an inability to regulate our emotion. That might be one of the warning signs. It could be excessive anxiety, constant fatigue, low motivation. You will know yourself, hopefully, well enough to understand when your mind and body are starting to give you some warning signs that require your attention. You can go back and have a look at previous episodes where we talk about the importance of knowing yourself. Now, you know, I was particularly bad for a long time, actually, at understanding when to give myself a break. I used to use another car analogy, I used to redline. And I always thought that there was no downside to always being the one who was grinding, always being the hardest worker in the room, no matter what. And the reality is, and I learned this the hard way, the reality is that unless you can translate that effort into results, it's ineffective effort and therefore pointless. So we need to be really targeted and specific with our effort, but not only that, it's not just effort alone that is required for success. You know, we've all had that experience personally or seen it in somebody else where someone's just going through the motions. The effort is there, sort of, but there's a component missing. And that's because we need all facets of our being to be in sync and working together to deliver those results that we're after. And without one of those things, the whole thing falls apart because effort alone is not enough. I mentioned it has to be targeted and strategic, but it has to be accompanied by a certain vitality of mind and soul. Perhaps the best way to say it is it has to be accompanied by emotional investment. And you can tell when someone's not quite invested from an emotional perspective with respect to the effort that they're putting out. So what do the solutions look like? Because we want to make sure that we don't get there. You know, I'm a big fan of that analogy or that theory rather, that prevention is better than cure. You know, you really don't want to get burned out if you can help it. So how do we stop ourselves from getting there? So firstly, and as I said, refer to previous episodes, you've got to know yourself. You've got to know the warning signs. You have to understand when to hit the brakes or to think about putting in place mitigation strategies. I'll tie it back to a personal level and just note that everybody's different before I go through this, this list. I find exercise helps me a hell of a lot, particularly in nature. So if I can get outside, go for a walk amongst, the trees, or, some sort of nice, calm setting where nature is prevalent, I find that really helps me to mitigate stress. I find movement, whether it's resistance training or cardio work, really helps me get out of my head a little bit and into my body and dissipate stress. From a personal perspective, I train in jiu-jitsu. That's fantastic because you've got all the benefits of cardio and resistance training just by nature of the martial art, but you've also got the community aspect of it as well, where you're catching up with like-minded people, you're working together to help each other improve, iron sharpens iron, so to speak, and that ticks a lot of boxes for me from a stress mitigation perspective. But it might be different for you. You've got to figure out what makes you tick. The other one that I really like is time with friends and family. I do find that I'm the sort of person that gets energy from other people. So I need to make sure that I'm spending time with friends and family on a relatively consistent basis. Another big one for me is mental framing. So what do I mean by that? Do you really need to work as much overtime as what you are working? Do you need to take a particular situation as seriously as what you're taking it? Just the very act of being really cognizant of how we're framing things in our own minds can be very helpful from a useful adjustment perspective, because if there's no point in taking something particularly seriously, or if there's no point in working 2 hours overtime every single day because it's not really getting you any sort of sustainable result, then you really do have to ask yourself if you're spinning your wheels and if there's any logic in continuing that behaviour. We've also got the annual leave reserves that we can tap into as well. Use your annual leave. Holiday at home. You don't have to go on an international trip. You can spend a week at home if you want. Use the time that you have to ensure that you stay charged and ready. Then we come to the difficult decision of perhaps considering whether we need to get a new job. If your workplace is toxic, which is one of the risk factors that can lead to burnout, if your workplace is like that, if the workload is super heavy and unrelenting, if it's a nasty environment to work in which requires you to be there for excessive overtime hours on a regular basis, perhaps no amount of solutionizing, exercise, spending time with friends and family, framing it mentally in a really correct and logical way, taking our annual leave. Maybe none of those things will suffice. Maybe we cannot fix what is broken and we need to get ourselves into a healthier environment. That is also a possibility, guys. Don't underestimate the power of a change. And trust your gut. If your gut says, I think we make a change, analyze it logically. Employ your critical thinking skills, sure. But don't disregard your gut. It's often correct. So I hope that helps. I hope that you have a better understanding as to what burnout is, how prevalent it is, how to manage it, or avoid it rather, within yourself. But also I hope that now you're armed with some knowledge and advice that you can perhaps distribute to your team members to ensure that they don't encounter burnout. Because as leaders, it is our responsibility, of course, to look after those we lead and ensure their safety. And burnout is a psychosocial hazard. So something that we are ourselves as leaders required to be emotionally invested in when it comes to preventing harm to our staff members. Guys, as always, if you are getting value from the show, please hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast app you consume the show on. Tell a friend, tell two friends, tell all your friends to jump in and give the show a listen. I do often use the analogy that, leadership really, even if you're not a leader, affects every single one of us because we all have to work under someone. So it is in everybody's interest for the standard of leadership globally to be as high as it can possibly be. And with your help, I'm going to do my bit to ensure that we do boost the standard globally. So tell a friend, tell many friends, spread the word, and hopefully we can have some sort of meaningful impact on the standard of leadership. Guys, until next time, I'll leave it there, but stay safe, and I look forward to you joining me for the next one.